Michael Landon's final episode of Little House on the Prairie carried an emotional weight viewers could never have imagined at the time. Behind the familiar smile, the beloved character, and the final moments on screen was a man facing a reality that would soon change everything. What happened during those last days, and why does watching his final appearance feel so heartbreaking today? The truth is even more painful than the episode itself. Long before Michael Landon became the heart of Little House on the Prairie, his life was already shaped by struggle, pressure, and a need to prove himself. But the story of the man millions would later know as Charles Pa Ingalls did not begin on a television set. It began with a difficult childhood, a complicated family life, and a young boy who learned very early that being strong did not always mean feeling strong. Michael Landon was born Eugene Maurice Orowitz on October 31st, 1936, in Forest Hills, Queens, New York. His father, Eli Maurice Orowitz, worked in entertainment and radio. His mother, Peggy, was deeply religious and had a very different personality from his father. At home, Michael experienced something that would stay with him for years. His mother struggled with emotional problems, and as a child, Michael became extremely sensitive to the moods around him. He often worried about her. He watched, he listened, and he learned to carry emotions that a child should never have to carry alone. But there was another challenge. Michael was not the kind of child who immediately looked like a future television star. In school, he struggled with academics. Yet he discovered something he could do better than almost anyone expected. He could throw. As a teenager, Michael became an outstanding athlete, especially in track and field. His strength was real, and for a while sports seemed like a possible way out. Then an injury changed that dream. His athletic future disappeared, and suddenly, the young man who had been building his identity around physical ability had to find another direction. That moment mattered more than it seemed, because Michael had already learned something important about life. Plans can disappear without warning. He began looking for another path. Eventually, he turned toward acting. At first, there was nothing glamorous about it. There were auditions, small opportunities, rejection, and uncertainty. Hollywood was filled with young people who wanted to become stars, and Michael was just one of them. But he had something that would later become one of his greatest strengths. He understood people. He understood pain. He understood family. And he understood what it felt like to be underestimated. In 1957, he landed a role that would change his career. He was cast as Tony Rivers in the film I Was a Teenage Werewolf. The movie was far from the kind of serious drama that would define his later work, but it gave him something priceless: visibility. Hollywood began to notice him. Soon came another major opportunity when he joined the cast of The Adventures of Jim Bowie. Then, in 1959, he became Little Joe Cartwright on Bonanza. That role transformed everything. For years, audiences watched Michael Landon grow from a young actor into one of television's most recognizable faces. But Landon did not want to remain only an actor. He wanted control over the stories. He wanted to write. He wanted to direct. And most importantly, he wanted to create stories about ordinary people dealing with extraordinary emotions. That ambition eventually led him to Little House on the Prairie. When the series premiered in 1974, Landon was not simply another actor appearing on television. He became one of the show's creative forces, playing Charles Ingalls while also writing and directing many episodes. For viewers, Pa was dependable. He was warm. He was protective. But those qualities were not completely separate from the man behind the character. Landon had spent much of his early life learning how powerful family relationships could be. Now he was using television to explore them. And that is what made Little House on the Prairie different. It was not only about life on the American frontier. It was about parents and children, loss and hope, failure and forgiveness, people trying to survive when life gave them reasons to give up. Millions of viewers connected with it. But there was something Landon could not have known when the series began. The same show that helped establish his television legacy would eventually become connected to one of the most painful final chapters of his life. And when viewers later looked back at those final moments, ordinary scenes suddenly carried a meaning nobody could have seen coming. But before that heartbreaking ending could arrive, Michael Landon still had years of success ahead of him. And the next turning point would take him from being a familiar television actor to becoming one of the most powerful creative forces on American television. But what happened next changed Michael Landon's career forever. He had already become famous as Little Joe Cartwright on Bonanza, but fame was not enough for him. Landon wanted to tell stories himself. He wanted to write them, shape them, and decide how audiences would experience them. That desire would eventually lead him to the role that defined his life. Charles Ingalls, the father at the center of Little House on the Prairie. By the early 1970s, Landon had spent more than a decade inside the television industry. Bonanza had made him a household name, but he was no longer the young actor who simply waited for someone else to give him a script. He had learned how television worked. He understood what made people laugh. He understood what made them cry. And more importantly, he understood what made them care about fictional families as if they were real. Then came the opportunity that would change everything. The television adaptation of Laura Ingalls Wilder's Little House books was being developed. Landon became deeply involved in the project, taking on the role of Charles Ingalls. At first glance, it might have seemed like another acting job. It was not. Landon became one of the show's writers, directors, and producers. He was helping build the world viewers would enter every week. Walnut Grove became more than a fictional town. For millions of people, it became a place they felt they knew. And Charles Ingalls became more than a character. He became Pa, the father who worked until his hands were tired, the man who protected his family, the man who sometimes made mistakes but tried to make things right, the man who could stand in the middle of a crisis and still tell his children that tomorrow could be better. That image became one of Landon's greatest achievements. But there was another reason his work connected so strongly with audiences. He did not make every story easy. Little House on the Prairie could be warm and funny, but it was also willing to explore death, poverty, illness, disability, rejection, grief, and family separation. The emotional stakes were often enormous. And Landon understood that audiences would stay with difficult stories if they believed the characters were real. That belief became one of his greatest creative weapons. The series quickly became a major success, and Landon's influence continued to grow. But success created its own pressure. He was no longer simply responsible for his performance. He was helping carry an entire television series. Every week, millions of viewers expected something meaningful, and Landon delivered. There were moments of humor, moments of heartbreak, and moments that became deeply remembered by fans. Yet the more successful the show became, the more complicated Landon's personal life also became. His career was moving upward, but his private world was not always simple. He had been married multiple times and had a large family. His personal relationships attracted public attention, particularly when his marriage to Lynn No ended and his relationship with Cindy Clerico became public. For some viewers, this complicated the image of the perfect family man they saw on television. But Landon himself was never simply one thing. He was an actor, a writer, a director, a producer, a father, a husband, and a man who had spent his entire life trying to turn difficult experiences into something meaningful. That complexity became important later because the man audiences saw on screen was not the complete person. Behind the television image was someone who had experienced rejection, family conflict, professional pressure, and enormous responsibility. And then came another major transformation. Landon's work on Little House had proven that he could create emotional television. But eventually, he would step even further behind the camera. He began producing and starring in another series, Highway to Heaven, where he played Jonathan Smith, an angel helping people through difficult moments. The role was completely different from Charles Ingalls, but the emotional philosophy was strangely familiar. Family, faith, loss, second chances, hope. These were the subjects Landon kept returning to. It was almost as if every show allowed him to explore another part of the same question. What does a person do when life becomes painful? That question would become far more personal than anyone expected. By the late 1980s, Landon had already created a remarkable television legacy. He had spent decades in front of cameras and behind them. Millions knew his face. Millions trusted his storytelling. And millions believed they understood the man they had watched for years. But the most difficult chapter of his life was still ahead. In 1991, something happened that would change the meaning of everything that came before. And suddenly, the man who had spent his career telling stories about courage, family, illness, and loss was forced to confront those themes in his own life. The next chapter would reveal how quickly everything began to change, and why the final years of Michael Landon's life would make his television work feel painfully different in retrospect. Do you think the characters Michael Landon played reflected parts of his real personality? Share your thoughts below. But Michael Landon's greatest rise was not simply about becoming famous. It was about becoming the person audiences trusted when a television story became emotional. By the time Little House on the Prairie entered its later seasons, Landon had become much more than the actor playing Charles Ingalls. He was one of the creative forces behind the series, and his decisions helped shape how millions of viewers experienced the show. When Little House on the Prairie premiered in 1974, nobody could know how deeply it would become part of American television history. The story followed the Ingalls family as they built a life in Walnut Grove, Minnesota. At the center was Charles Ingalls, played by Landon. For viewers, Charles was often the steady figure. When his family faced poverty, he worked. When his children were frightened, he comforted them. When the family suffered loss, he tried to hold everyone together. And when life seemed unfair, he kept moving forward. That image made Landon one of the most recognizable fathers on television. But there was an important difference between Landon and many actors who simply appeared in successful shows. He was helping create the stories. Landon wrote and directed numerous episodes, and his influence could be felt throughout the series. He understood that a television audience did not need every story to end perfectly. Sometimes, the most powerful ending was the one that left viewers thinking about their own families. That approach made Little House unusually emotional for its time. Episodes could move from humor to tragedy in a matter of minutes. A character could lose a loved one. A family could face financial hardship. A child could struggle with fear or rejection. And somehow, the story would still find a way to offer hope. This became a signature of Landon's work. He believed television could entertain people while also making them feel something, and viewers responded. As the years passed, Landon became a major television star. But his influence went beyond acting. He became a director and producer. He was making decisions that shaped the tone of his programs. And eventually, he created Highway to Heaven, another series that allowed him to explore emotional stories about ordinary people facing difficult moments. Once again, Landon placed himself at the center of stories about hope. But by this stage, his life was becoming more complicated. His fame meant that millions of people felt connected to him, even though they had never met him. That connection can be powerful. It can also become painful, because audiences often confuse the character with the person. To many viewers, Michael Landon was Charles Ingalls. He was the father figure, the man who seemed to know what to do when everything went wrong, the person who could walk into a difficult situation and somehow make it feel manageable. But real life does not work that way. And in 1991, Landon's own life suddenly became a story that no television script could control. He was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. The news was devastating. Landon was only 54 years old. For a man who had spent decades playing characters who fought through impossible situations, the diagnosis was especially painful. But Landon did something that revealed another side of his personality. He spoke publicly about his illness. Instead of completely disappearing, he chose to address what was happening. His condition became a subject of national attention, and his public statement showed that he wanted to remain honest about the seriousness of what he was facing. He began treatment, and for a time there was hope, but the cancer was aggressive, and the reality was becoming harder to escape. This is where Landon's story begins to feel almost unbearably connected to the stories he had spent his career telling. For decades, he had created television moments about people confronting fear. Now he was living through one himself, and suddenly, every scene involving Charles Ingalls carried a different meaning. A smile could feel heavier. A goodbye could feel more painful. A simple family conversation could become difficult to watch, because viewers now knew something the characters did not. They knew that the man behind the character was seriously ill, and that knowledge changed the way people looked at his work. But Landon still had unfinished professional business. there was one more television journey ahead, one final chapter, and it would eventually lead to the moments that fans now revisit with a completely different understanding. The heartbreaking truth was that Landon's final connection to Little House on the Prairie was not simply about an actor returning to a beloved show. It was connected to the ending of the series itself. And what happened during that ending has made the final episode particularly difficult for fans to watch. If you enjoy discovering the hidden stories behind the world's biggest television stars, subscribe. Because sometimes the most powerful stories are not the ones we see on screen, but the ones happening behind it. The final goodbye was getting closer, and this time, the audience would not be watching a fictional family say goodbye. They would be watching the end of an era. But the hardest part of Michael Landon's final chapter was not simply that he became sick. It was that his illness forced him to confront something he had spent his entire career trying to control: the ending. For decades, Landon had controlled the stories. He could decide when a character would suffer. He could decide when a family would fight. He could decide when the music would rise and when the scene would end. But cancer was different. There was no script. In April 1991, Landon learned that he had pancreatic cancer. The diagnosis came as a shock, not only because of the seriousness of the disease, but because of how quickly his life changed afterward. He was 54. He was still working. He was still planning projects. He was still a husband and father. And suddenly, time became something he could no longer take for granted. Landon chose to speak publicly about his condition. He appeared on television and gave interviews, discussing his illness with a level of openness that was difficult for many people to watch. There was hope at first. He underwent treatment and continued trying to live his life. But the disease progressed, and while the public was watching the news, Landon was dealing with something much more personal. His family was watching him change. His friends were watching him change. And the man millions had known for decades was now facing a reality that no amount of fame could stop. This is one of the reasons his final years feel so different when viewed today. Michael Landon had built his career around emotional strength. His characters were usually the people others depended on. But illness can reverse those roles. The person who once protected everyone else can suddenly become the person everyone worries about. That can be one of the most painful experiences any family can face. And there was another layer to the story. Landon's public image had been built around warmth and family values, but his real life had never been perfect. His marriages, divorces, and family relationships had sometimes been complicated and publicly discussed. That contrast mattered because Landon was not a fictional character. He was a human being with mistakes, regrets, successes, and difficult decisions. And perhaps that is why his story continues to connect with people. He was never completely polished. He was complicated. He could be successful and still struggle. He could make people laugh while carrying private pain. He could create stories about hope while facing fear in his own life. Meanwhile, Little House on the Prairie was approaching its own ending. The original series had already undergone major changes. Characters had come and gone. The Ingalls family had changed, and the television landscape itself was changing. By 1983, the original Little House on the Prairie series had reached its conclusion. But the story did not simply disappear. Television movies followed, including Look Back to Yesterday, Bless All the Dear Children, and The Last Farewell. And this is where the title of this documentary requires an important distinction. Michael Landon's final appearance connected to the Little House world was not simply a normal weekly episode of the original series. The story continued through television films, and Landon returned as Charles Ingalls. That final chapter became especially emotional because of what viewers would later learn about Landon's health. In The Last Farewell, Charles Ingalls returns to Walnut Grove and discovers that the town is facing a difficult future. The story itself involves a painful decision, but the emotional weight comes from something outside the fictional world. Landon was already seriously ill when these later Little House productions were made, and that changes the way the audience sees him. The face is familiar. The voice is familiar. The character is familiar. But now there is another layer underneath every scene. The audience knows that the actor is fighting for his own life. That creates a strange feeling when watching the footage. You are not simply watching Charles Ingalls. You are watching Michael Landon near the end of his own life. and the difference between fiction and reality becomes almost impossible to separate. The man who had spent years telling audiences that families could survive difficult times was now facing the most difficult battle of his own. Then came the final months. Landon's cancer continued to progress. He remained surrounded by family and loved ones. His condition became increasingly serious, and the public began to understand that this was no longer a temporary health crisis. The end was approaching, and that makes the final Little House footage so difficult for longtime fans. There is no dramatic announcement inside the fictional story. There is no sign saying, "This is goodbye." Instead, there is simply Michael Landon, older, tired, still performing, still telling a story. And that ordinary quality makes it even more painful, because sometimes the saddest goodbyes are not dramatic. Sometimes they happen quietly, before anyone realizes they are watching them. Landon's final television work would soon become part of his legacy. But one question remained. What exactly happened in those final Little House moments? And why does the ending feel so much more heartbreaking when you know what happened to Michael Landon only months later? The answer takes us directly into the final farewell, and the scenes that fans still struggle to watch without thinking about the man behind the character. But the most painful part of Michael Landon's final Little House chapter is that there was no dramatic goodbye designed to make viewers cry. Instead, the sadness comes from what we know now. The final Little House story connected to Landon was The Last Farewell, a television movie that aired in 1984. It brought Charles Ingalls back to Walnut Grove, where he discovered that the town was facing an uncertain future. The story itself was already emotional, but years later, knowing what happened to Landon makes those scenes feel completely different. In the story, Walnut Grove is threatened by forces that could destroy the community. Charles returns to the place that had been such an important part of his family's life. He tries to help the people around him, but eventually the story reaches a painful conclusion. The town's residents make an extraordinary decision. Rather than allow someone else to control their homes and their future, they choose to destroy the buildings themselves. It is a powerful ending for a series built around the idea of home. Walnut Grove was not simply a location. For viewers, it represented family. It represented childhood. It represented a simpler world where people could suffer, argue, forgive, and still come together. And then, suddenly, that world was being destroyed. But there is another reason the ending has such emotional power. Michael Landon was not only acting in the story. He was one of the people who had helped create the world viewers were now watching disappear. For nearly a decade, he had been one of the central faces of Little House on the Prairie. Now, the town itself was coming to an end. The buildings were coming down. The characters were moving on. And the television audience was being asked to say goodbye. There is something almost symbolic about that. A man who had built so much of his career around creating a television family was helping bring that world to an end. But there is an important fact that is sometimes misunderstood. The Last Farewell was not Michael Landon's final acting appearance before his death. His final television series was Us, which aired in 1991. And that distinction matters, because the real tragedy of Landon's story is not that his final Little House appearance was secretly filmed while he was dying. It wasn't. The Last Farewell came years before his cancer diagnosis. What makes it painful today is the knowledge that the man who played Charles Ingalls would later face his own final farewell. That is what gives the footage its haunting quality. The sadness comes from hindsight. At the time, viewers were watching the ending of a beloved television story. They had no idea they would eventually watch the actor himself become the subject of one of television's most heartbreaking real-life stories. When Landon was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer in 1991, the world saw a very different side of him. He spoke openly about his illness. He continued working when he could, and he spent time with the people closest to him. But the disease moved quickly. On July 1st, 1991, Michael Landon died at his home in Malibu, California. He was only 54 years old. For millions of viewers, the news was difficult to accept. The man they had known as Little Joe, the man they had known as Pa Ingalls, the man who had spent decades appearing on television, was gone. And suddenly, old episodes became something different. A scene that once seemed ordinary could now feel like a goodbye. A smile could feel like a memory. A line about family could sound like something much deeper. That is the strange power of television. Actors can leave behind images of themselves that remain frozen in time. Michael Landon never grew old on screen in the same way his audience did. His younger performances remain. His voice remains. His smile remains. And his characters continue to exist every time someone presses play. But perhaps the most emotional part of his legacy is that his work continues to speak to the same human fears he faced himself. Family, loss, love, hope, and the knowledge that life can change without warning. That is why watching his final Little House stories today can feel so difficult. Not because the production was designed as a final goodbye to Michael Landon, but because we know what came later. We know the ending, and that knowledge changes everything. Everyone has experienced a goodbye they were not ready for. Maybe it was a person, a place, a childhood, or simply a period of life that could never return. That is part of why Michael Landon's story still feels so personal decades later. His final years were not simply about death. They were also about what remains after someone is gone. And Michael Landon left behind something far more lasting than a television role. He left behind stories that still make people laugh, cry, and remember the people they love. But there was one final question. What did Michael Landon leave behind after the cameras stopped rolling? And why does his legacy continue to grow even after more than 3 decades? But Michael Landon's story did not truly end when the cameras stopped rolling. In some ways, that was when his most lasting legacy began. When Landon died on July 1st, 1991, he left behind a career that had already lasted for more than 3 decades. He had been an actor, writer, director, producer, and one of the most recognizable faces in American television. But his greatest achievement may have been something much simpler. He made people care. Millions of viewers cared about little Joe Cartwright. They cared about Charles Ingalls. They cared about the families and strangers who appeared in his stories. And they cared because Landon understood something powerful about television. People may forget a plot. They may forget a line. But they rarely forget how a story made them feel. That idea explains why Little House on the Prairie remains meaningful to audiences decades after its original run. The show dealt with problems that have not disappeared. Families still struggle. Parents still worry about their children. People still experience loss. People still face poverty, rejection, illness, loneliness, and fear. And people still search for hope. Landon built those themes into his work again and again. His stories were not perfect reflections of real life. They were television, but they often tried to show that even during the darkest moments, people could choose kindness. That became a major part of his legacy. And then there is Charles Ingalls. For many viewers, Charles was the Michael Landon character, the father figure, the protector, the person who kept going when everyone else was ready to give up. That image became so powerful that it eventually became difficult for audiences to separate the character from the man who played him. But perhaps they were never meant to be completely separated. Landon had experienced difficult moments in his own life. He had known rejection. He had experienced complicated family relationships. He had faced professional pressure. And near the end of his life, he faced a devastating illness. Yet he continued working. That determination is one of the most important lessons in his story. Michael Landon did not know how much time he had left, but he continued to create. He continued to communicate with his audience, and he continued to spend time with the people closest to him. His death came far too early. He was only 54, but the amount of work he left behind was extraordinary. From Bonanza to Little House on the Prairie and Highway to Heaven, his career touched several generations. And today, new viewers can still discover him. A young person can watch Little House for the first time and see Charles Ingalls as simply a character. Then they can learn about Michael Landon. They can discover his real story. And suddenly, the character becomes something more. A window into the life of the person who created him. That is why the final Little House moments are so emotional today. They are not heartbreaking because Landon knew they were his final scenes. They are heartbreaking because we know what happened afterward. There is a difference. The audience watching in 1984 could simply see the ending of a television era. The audience watching today sees something else. We see a performer who would continue working, We see a man whose life still had years ahead of him, and we know that only a few years later, his own life would be nearing its end. That knowledge creates an emotional layer that was never part of the original script. It is called hindsight, and sometimes hindsight can completely change the meaning of an old scene. A smile becomes more emotional. A goodbye becomes heavier. A familiar voice becomes something we want to hold on to. Michael Landon understood the power of emotional storytelling because he had spent his life creating it. Ironically, his own life eventually became one of those stories. A young boy from Queens became a television star. That star became a writer and director. The actor became a beloved father figure. The storyteller became a cultural icon. And then, at only 54, he was gone. But the stories remained. That may be the most important part of all. Because fame disappears. Television shows end. Buildings come down. Characters leave. But stories can survive. Every time someone watches Little House on the Prairie, Michael Landon appears again. Not as the man fighting cancer. Not as the celebrity whose life ended too soon. But as Charles Ingalls. Standing beside his family. Trying to protect them. Trying to make tomorrow better. And perhaps that is the most fitting ending for a man who spent so much of his career telling audiences that life could be painful, but people could still find a reason to keep going. Michael Landon could not control how his own story ended. None of us can, but he could control what he left behind. And what he left behind was a body of work that continues to make people feel something. So when you watch those final Little House moments again, remember the difference between the character and the man. Charles Ingalls was fictional. Michael Landon was real. The goodbye in the story was scripted. The goodbye that came years later was not. And perhaps that is why his work remains so difficult to watch sometimes. Because somewhere between the character, the actor, and the memories of millions of viewers, television captured something that feels very human. Nothing lasts forever, but the love we leave behind can. And Michael Landon left plenty of it. If this story moved you, the next documentary may reveal another heartbreaking side of a beloved television star whose final years were nothing like the image audiences saw on screen.